I'd like to thank Alex and Jorge for a very engaging and thorough look at Jorge's practice, and especially kind of globally, and with the notions of design and desire. This brings us to our third session, and I very much the flow now is starting to shape and colour where this Skype session is kind of taking us on this journey. And Shamin Momin will be our third speaker. So Shamin is a former contemporary curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art and is based in New York and Los Angeles, where she's a founder-director of the recently formed Los Angeles Nomadic Division. This is a non-profit public art organisation. Her most recent projects include Nothingness and Being, and in addition to her Whitney exhibition catalogues, Momin has contributed to numerous other publications, including artist monographs, exhibition catalogues and art periodicals. Importantly, she has curated 2 Whitney biennials, and also organised in conjunction an Independent Curators International exhibition in 2007. So in our third Skype session, I'm looking forward to a conversation between Shamin and Jorge that examines Jorge's practice in the template of the museum itself, and that kind of notion of how the exhibition evolves, but also as an artist, how Jorge feels with his work being almost fused in the notion of the retrospective. So I would like to welcome Shamin and Jorge, and I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
I'm really interested in what you said about artwork having to behave like film, which relates to a degree to my first question, which is centered around the idea of hybrid practice and production and the blurring of those distinctions between genre and experience. And this exhibition as a kind of culmination of that idea, like assembling the cumulative practice of what you've been doing into this, I mean, what seems to me kind of like a meta environment, and that the document of the exhibit, quote unquote, document of the exhibition then, reverts to the actual objects, which we touched upon as well, this kind of inversion, this a notion of hybridity, and I talked about it a million times, and so I was trying to think about how that then fed into this sort of, meta exhibition. I'm sorry, it's an annoying term, but it's kind of the way.
I don't disagree with the analysis of it at all. I think the term meta is a very appropriate term to use in just about everything. Sense, because the shift in things is the thing that actually kind of, it produces the meta situation in the sense that you sort of get the same thing once again. I think the idea of a hybrid, I think that there is a kind of a positivism in the forward-looking aspect of relying on a notion like hybridity, which I don't always see play out. I think the most vulnerable core within the ideologies of most of these traditions is this notion that there is a coming together of things through a kind of a dissolving of these different types of practices, and I think architecture, one of them is actually it's the one that requires that commit the most. Mm-hmm. It's music and stone or some bullshit like that. What I want to do with this exhibition is, number one, I want to look at the history of the things I've done. Number two, I want, in the process of looking at the history of what I've done, to look at myself, to look at my relationship between the place I'm doing it, to look at the relationship between this show and the last show, this show and, existing sort of motions and techniques that I've used for other shows. But at the core of it all, I really want to really have a lot of information about who I am, what kind of art I do, what are the different strategies what are the conditions that produce that who are the people that I've sort of listened to or been with? I mean, what was happening in my environment as it was going on? There's a timeline of the LA Times that runs through this whole thing, and at the same time, it's like this thing wants to be an odd object because it doesn't want to just be odd. It wants to be odd because it needs to be odd in order for this sort of meta condition to be real.
This idea of the survey approach, how does that, you've sort of answered it, feel in any way a definitive stage? I mean, I've always been interested in the way that artists that I've worked with at the Whitney in the past, over the time that I was there, started to get very uncomfortable with the notion of the term retrospective, for example, and wanted to call things mid-career surveys or not call them anything that was summary in any way. Their argument being that they weren't done, that this was like fixing things, making them static in time. And it's interesting to me to kind of, from what you just said, to explore how you responded, or maybe you could comment a bit on that notion and how you responded to it with, to my mind, by choosing a format that addresses it sort of head on.
I love the notion of retrospective. I'd like to do one every year. Because it's like being a bull in a china shop. There are so many things that can go wrong in an interesting way. And the premise is flawed. It's, a retrospective, and maybe the premise isn't flawed, because at the end of the day, retrospective is a pretty interesting and kind of productive and somewhat benign thing, which is that we just want to look at what you've done, and you've been doing it a while. And that's really the contract between the invitation to the exhibition and the person involved. But I don't have any anxiety about being part of my own summation.
But I think maybe your active involvement in that, in the way that, again, the sort of construct of the show that you've obviously developed together with Rachel is maybe a way to avoid that sort of anxiety that was being expressed by, in this case, often artists, even farther along in their careers, but where they were, I think, fearing the notion of this sort of static narrative. So
every artist that does a retrospective takes intense control of their summation. But there's something necessary for some sense of self-legitimizing or something, that this anxiety needs to sort of fit into something weird in order for it to sort of be read as real work. And that is interesting to me.
It's interesting because that kind of brings in this notion of power, the power dialogue, and the subversion of that was brought up. And I was thinking about that in terms of the catalog itself and sort of, again, what you're doing with it here. There are 2 points to that. The one is the idea of the catalog as document versus a kind of analog object with the show that I personally found in my practice has been a constant, very, very constant issue with the artists that I work with, where been very conscious of the idea that the catalog is going to be the sort of longevity to some degree, and the way in which other people experience their work, and thus wanting that to have more of an analogous relationship than one that's documentary. But how to do that whilst also capturing within this structure that you're talking about.
I want the catalog to be the show. I'm not interested in so much just shifting these relationships against it. I really do believe that there are no, in terms of as an object sort of that bears itself as a kind of a reflexive component of somebody's work, the catalog is as important as the sculpture, as the building, as the institution, and that's what I'm trying to buy. I'm buying for that notion. Mm-hmm. For me, the most interesting works, they lie in public experience. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they get there in very conscious and productive ways. Sometimes they just kind of land. And I'm less and less interested in doing exhibitions in galleries that have, it's like things like that. I mean, I still do a lot of them because we all make a living that way. But the way I've sort of done it is I use it as I have a certain developmental sort of mode that's in the studio where I was making things like that. And it's great to have your galleries as a kind of an output, almost like think about the gallery almost the same way that you think about a Moss or something in New York. It's great. It's fantastic. But the galleries, like an art fair, and even to some degree less, are places where it's very difficult to start this sort of reflexive engine in a very convincing way. Because the context is gamed, and it's gamed in a very clear way. So the thing about doing works in the public is that, yeah, it's gamed, but that gaming is only going to inscribe itself into a tiny percentage of the people who actually kind of up against the stuff and actually interact. And there are a lot of different things that can happen. One of the most successful pieces I've ever done was the Munster Pier. And it's got a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot. It can begin by how is this thing chosen to be a sculpture? It's a pier, whatever. I mean, why I think that work was so successful is because the museum and the exhibition wanted to get rid of the work. It was a public outcry. The city bought it. So that is probably the most rewarding thing that an artist can do, from my point of view, is that you actually make something that has some sort of social impact. Hey, there's value in this stuff in some way. It's like when